Hello, and welcome to our Patreon voted video for February. I know it's March, but I had bronchitis, okay? I'm sorry, I don't mean to get so defensive. We're finally here. We're finally talking about our Patreon voted video, which is how to edit your book in 4 very simple steps. You have this gorgeous project in front of you that you spent hours and hours and hours bringing to life and putting on paper. One of my favorite things to do when I finish a book is print it out. And I know that's a little indulgent, maybe, of me, but just looking at that stack of pages and holding it and knowing it's real now, you made that, but it's not perfect. As Shannon Hale so beautifully said, I'm writing a first draft and reminding myself that I am simply shoveling sand into a box so that later I can build castles. I love this quote. It's so true. No work of art is ever done, just abandoned, right? The time has come for you to edit your wonderful, beautiful thing that you have created. And editing is truly, I think, where the magic happens. A lot of authors fear and kind of dislike editing, but I love it. It's one of my favorite pieces of the creative process because this is where you turn your story into what it's meant to be. And if you're anything like me, then your inner editor was berating you as you were writing about things that needed to be fixed, and now is the time to bring that to light and let that inner editor breathe. It's just I love this part of the process. So let's jump into these steps for how to edit your novel. I'm gonna give you a quick overview first. Step 1, take a break. Step 2, do a developmental edit. Step 3, edit scene by scene. And step 4, do one last pass. Let's get into step 1, taking a break from your story. So typically books take me a while to write. I'm not the quickest writer. I'm not the most efficient writer. I'm not the most deadline or time-oriented writer. I just write when it comes to me. I don't write every single day. All of those rules are rules that I break, okay? I give you permission to also break them. So typically I would say, however long the story takes you to write, spend half that time away from it. For people like me who take a long time to write, that can be a really long amount of time. But for Burnish, it was a series of short stories that each took me about 2 months, so I would take about 4 to 6 weeks away from each of them before I edited. For other books that take me a little longer, I take 3 months. So I suggest taking 3 to 4 months between when you finish your story until you edit it. And why do you want to do this? First of all, it clears your head. You can step away from your subjective view of this story and come back more objectively. And when you come back objectively, you can kind of approach it as a reader would. This time, you're removed from the story. It's been a minute since you were so embroiled in it and in the writing process. So you can see more of how a reader would be impacted by what's happening. Also, our brains just get tired after thinking about one thing for a really long time. So when you give yourself a little break before you come back, you're giving your brain a chance to breathe. And by the time you come back to your story, you might have some questions or things ironed out from aha moments that you've had while you've been away from the story, or you might have insights into how you want to change certain characters or how certain scenes should go and stuff like that. Feel free during this break to write down ideas and stuff like that about what you want to edit. You don't have to forget about your story completely during this break. So that is, if those come to you during your breaks, definitely take note of them, but don't immediately go put them in the story. Step 2 is a developmental edit. When you're editing a book, there are 2 kinds of editing, developmental and line editing is what they call it. I don't know if there's a more specific term, but the line editing is editing stuff like flow and grammar and syntax and all of that, and that comes later. Developmental edits are about making sure your plot is where you want it to be. So start your developmental outline with a little log line. And I found this formula for a great log line from Reedsy, which is character must do something to achieve goal, or else reason why the audience should care. If you can't get this log line ironed out, then you have some pretty glaring challenges with your characters and their motivations and why the reader should care about these motivations and therefore the rest of your story. Second, make a scene-by-scene outline of your story. See if your story follows the plot points you wanted. Did you plot the story with the 4-act structure? Does it stick to the 4-act structure? Did you use the story circle? Does it make sense with the story circle? See if it all lines up. Look at the domino effect of the story and see if the protagonist created the events that are happening. In the best stories like Breaking Bad and Ozark, I'm on a Breaking Bad and Ozark dark streak right now, okay? In these stories, you can trace back every single thing from the very end all the way to decisions that the character made at the beginning. This is the basis of a good story because your character is an active participant. They are creating their world. They are creating the things and the problems that we want to see them solve. It's also true to real life. We create our own issues, our internal conflict and our decisions that we make in order to run from our fear and chase our desires is what makes the conflict that we go through. So if you have a story with this domino effect, it's going to be relatable, it's going to feel real, your characters are going to feel fleshed out. It's a recipe for success. Ask yourself during this whole look at your outline, do the character arcs pan out like you wanted? Do the characters grow how you wanted them to? Are your characters and their actions three-dimensional and believable? And don't forget about your antagonist here. That is a fatal mistake, a fatal pitfall that some people run into. Are there any plot holes in your story or things that need to be tweaked? I recommend using my scenes and sequels videos to see if the pacing of your overall story feels good and is easy to follow. So why do this next? Why take a break and then go immediately into developmental editing? You might be saying, but Natalie, I know I didn't describe things well enough in this one scene, or I know that my character acted strangely in chapter 2. We'll fix it. But before we can iron out those little details, we need to take a look at the bigger picture. Addressing things like character voice and the level of description now won't matter if you decide to move scenes around or even cut them out completely when you do your developmental edit. Here are a few questions to ask yourself as you're doing your developmental edit of your story. Is the plot engaging? Is it believable? Some genres require you to suspend your disbelief, but is it believable within the world of the story? My book Burnish is not believable. It's not set in the real world. It is a dark fantasy tragedy, but everything that happens in those stories is believable in the context of those stories and in the context of those characters. Are all loose ends tied up by the end? If not, why not? If the answer is because there's a sequel, that's fine. If the answer is because some questions are better left unanswered, make sure you haven't left too many unanswered. Step 3 is to edit scene by scene, and while you're doing this, I recommend paying attention to 3 things, the first of which is pacing. And I recommend watching my video on motivation reaction units for this one, because that video will help you make sure everything lines up and everything makes sense. Using that strategy, you can verify that characters aren't reacting to things before they're actually shown those things, stuff like that. 2, pay attention to characterization. Are the characters responding how they usually would? Does their voice sound like them? How does this scene further character development and advance the plot? How does inner conflict or your antagonist, the external conflict, or both, show up in this scene? I'll give you a hint. If there's none of either, if there's no internal or external conflict, you might not need the scene. And you can also check out this video if you want to see if you should really cut that scene. 3, pay attention to description. When you step into the scene, does it drip from your fingertips? Do you describe everything using the 5 senses? Are there any inconsistencies in the scene, such as a character sitting down and then suddenly standing in a different part of the room with no explanation? Is character voice and the overall tone of this scene and point of view and all of that stuff used in the description? If you do this, this will make the whole story and every single scene feel so much more real and thought out. The best books are the kinds that kind of grab us, right? Like my saying in my intro is stories that transport you. When you are reading a story that transports you, it's because they made sure that these things were aligned in their descriptions, and that's why you can't stop reading, because you are there. You are in the story. And in order for your readers to feel that way, everything needs to flow very smoothly and seamlessly. If you have things that are unexplained or things that are suddenly happening or things that don't feel quite right, your readers will get confused and they'll say, wait, where am I? Wait, was this character sitting down before? Wait, would this character really say that? And then you have a story that is reminding them that it was written by somebody and pulling them out of the moment, instead of a story that feels like just the tale of someone's journey. Another thing to look out for as you're doing this scene by scene is head hopping, which you can fall into if you have multiple point of view characters. Make sure that one character is narrating the entire scene. Don't suddenly jump to somebody else's descriptions, somebody else's voice, somebody else's views. That's a thing that beginner writers especially can really struggle with, and it's definitely gonna pull your readers out of that flow of the story. Step 4, do one last pass. This time, I want you to read your book all the way through, and I want you to read it out loud, because that's gonna show you if any of the sentences sound weird, if any of what the characters are saying isn't quite right, all of that stuff. And while you're doing this, I would keep an eye out for grammar, as well as sentence structure and flow. So make sure not all of your sentences are short, not all of them are long. They're in between, they're flowing, they're like this quote that I can't remember, but it's about words being music. Make sure that your sentences are like that. And that way, they will flow and your readers will just be caught in this stream of sensation and not in this, wait, I'm reading a short sentence over and over and over type feeling. Do your best here to eliminate any passive voice. Watch out for too many dialogues such as shouted, exclaimed, stated, and limit how many adverbs you're using. Another reason why you should read your story out loud during this step is because you've read it a lot of times at this point. You wrote it, you've read it probably 3 or 4 times by now. Reading it out loud is going to really help you focus and hone in on those issues. So that's it. Those are my 4 super simple tips for how to edit your novel. And if you found this video, please don't forget to like it, comment, share it, subscribe. I appreciate you all being here, and I will see you in the next one. Happy trails.